5 words, that's all it took. Not shouted, not dramatic. Just 5 quiet words that turned a confident man into someone who suddenly understood. He hadn't won anything. He had just inherited the consequences. This isn't a story about yelling, exposing, or revenge in the obvious sense. It's about patience and what happens when someone asks for everything without knowing what everything actually costs. For most of my life, I was the quiet one, the reliable one, the person who made sure things didn't fall apart, while someone else took the credit for holding them together. I didn't argue. I didn't compete. I didn't announce what I was doing. I watched. I documented. I kept notes in a folder labeled miscellaneous, the kind no one ever opens twice. People mistook that for weakness, even the man who shared my breakfast table for 15 years. What he never understood was this: silence isn't the absence of strategy. Sometimes it is the strategy. I learned that sitting at my kitchen table long after midnight, laptop closed, listening to the refrigerator hum, while the rest of the apartment slept. To understand why I smiled in that courtroom, you need to understand why I waited. This is how it happened. His attorney leaned in and whispered 5 words, just 5. And in that instant, Daniel Hale's face emptied of color. Not flushed, not angry, empty, like someone had pulled the plug and drained whatever confidence had been propping him upright for years. His jaw tightened, then loosened. His hands, the same hands that had signed contracts without reading them, began to shake. The stack of papers in front of him trembled like they were alive and trying to escape. For 15 years, I had eaten breakfast across from that face. Calm, certain, smug in a quiet way that made people trust him. That morning, it finally cracked. I didn't move, I didn't speak, I didn't even breathe differently. I smiled, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to feel it. That smile had taken 3 years to earn. Around us, the courtroom stayed still. Polished wood, muted colors, lawyers pretending not to notice what was happening 2 feet away. The judge reviewing paperwork, unaware she was about to witness a man discover that victory and ownership are not the same thing. Daniel had come to court expecting to collect his reward: the house, the company, the cars, everything. He had said the word everything with so much confidence that it sounded permanent. What he didn't understand, what no one understood yet, was that he had asked for far more than he could carry. The papers he was so eager to sign were no longer contracts. They were weights, and those 5 words his lawyer whispered were not dramatic. They weren't cruel. They weren't even loud. They were factual. They were final. That was the moment patience paid interest. I adjusted my posture, folded my hands, let the room stay quiet, because to understand why I smiled, you have to understand why I waited. Before I was someone people whispered about, before anyone thought I'd lost my nerve or my mind, I was simply a woman who believed in building things carefully. My name is Marina Cole. I was 34 years old when my marriage officially ended, though in truth it had been unraveling for much longer than that. I met Daniel when I was 17, freshly graduated from high school, and intensely motivated to leave my childhood home behind. Not because it was terrible, but because I understood something early. Independence is easier to protect when you start young. I wasn't brilliant. I wasn't reckless. I was practical. I took a file clerk job at a mid-sized law office downtown. Minimum wage, endless paperwork, paper cuts that stung more than they should have. But it was mine. I learned quickly. I watched quietly. By 19, I was assisting attorneys, organizing case files, managing deadlines, understanding how money moved and how mistakes got buried. Daniel was 6 years older, charismatic in a contained way, the kind of man who spoke about the future as if it already belonged to him. He talked about ambition like it was a personality trait instead of a skill. Real estate, development. Building something real, he called it. I called it paperwork waiting to happen. We married when I was 19. Our son, Oliver, came a year later. I worked part-time while raising him, stacking savings without making a show of it. My grandmother had raised me on a principle she repeated often and without apology. A woman should always have her own money. Not hidden, not deceptive, just hers. Something no one could reassign. I believed her. When Daniel's business finally showed signs of taking off, he asked me to leave my job and help him full-time. He said he needed someone he could trust completely, someone loyal, someone capable. I agreed. That decision looked like love from the outside. It looked like partnership. It looked like sacrifice. In reality, it was the moment my name slowly disappeared from everything I helped build. At the time, I didn't notice. I was busy. Busy felt productive. Useful felt secure. And for a long while, I mistook being needed for being valued. That misunderstanding would cost me years. But it also taught me how to wait. When people talk about building a business, they imagine big decisions and bold moves. They picture vision boards and handshakes and champagne flutes clinking over closing deals. What they don't picture is the quiet labor that makes those moments possible. For 11 years, I became that quiet labor. I managed the books, every invoice, every payment, every late fee, smoothed over with a polite email and a promise I knew I could keep. I fixed mistakes before clients ever noticed them. I made sure problems disappeared quietly. My official role was wife. My actual role was the reason nothing collapsed. I did all of it without a salary, without a title, without a single line on a company directory. When people asked what I did, Danielle would smile and say, "She helps me out." As if 11 years of unpaid expertise were a hobby I enjoyed between school drop-offs and grocery runs. At industry events, I stood beside him while he accepted compliments. He thanked mentors. He thanked his team. My name never came up. At home, I handled everything else. Oliver's school schedules, doctor appointments. I kept our life running so smoothly that Daniel never had to think about it. And because he never had to think about it, he slowly stopped seeing it. That's how exploitation usually begins. Not with cruelty, but with convenience. As the business grew, Daniel grew louder. More decisive, more dismissive. He stopped asking for my input. He started informing me of decisions I had already accounted for in spreadsheets he never looked at. When I pointed out risks, he called me cautious. When I flagged inconsistencies, he called me negative. When I suggested slowing down, he accused me of not believing in him. Not believing in him. I was running the entire back end of his operation while raising his son and managing our home. But belief apparently required silence. I adjusted. I always did. I learned when to speak and when to document. I learned which arguments weren't worth winning and which details needed to be preserved. I learned how to sound agreeable while protecting the structure underneath. From the outside, our life looked enviable. A growing business, a nice house, stability. There was a period when I still believed our life could be curated into calm. I remember standing in the hardware store, holding paint swatches under fluorescent lights, trying to decide what would make the house feel quieter. I chose sage green for the kitchen, soft, muted, a color that didn't demand attention. Daniel didn't care. He waved it off, said it all looked the same to him. But every morning after that, I stood in that kitchen drinking coffee, convincing myself that peace could be selected, that if I chose carefully enough, life would eventually follow. I didn't know yet that calm isn't something you paint over chaos. It has to be built somewhere new. From the inside, I was becoming invisible. Those assumptions would collapse later, but while they stood, I worked, and I remembered everything. The change didn't arrive all at once. It never does. There was no single argument, no dramatic betrayal that announced itself. Instead, things shifted quietly, the way furniture gets rearranged while you're not in the room. Everything was still there. It just wasn't where it used to be. Daniel started making decisions without mentioning them to me. Not big ones at first, minor things. A contractor switched, a payment delayed, a client promised something we couldn't realistically deliver. When I noticed and asked about it, he brushed it off, said he had it handled, said I worried too much. He began staying late more often, working dinners, networking events, meetings that ran long. He stopped explaining because, according to him, explanations slowed things down. Efficiency became his favorite word. Control came disguised as productivity. Then the commentary started. He didn't like how I dressed anymore, said I looked tired, said I'd let myself go, as if raising a child and running his entire operation were indulgences. He criticized meals I cooked, schedules I kept, the way I organized our days. He framed it all as concern. Helpful suggestions, guidance. Criticism always sounds reasonable when it's delivered calmly. When I pushed back, he accused me of being defensive. When I went quiet, he accused me of not caring. Either way, the problem was always me. The most effective form of control isn't shouting, it's erosion. Little by little, he treated my contributions as expected rather than earned. My opinions became obstacles, my caution became weakness, my experience became irrelevant the moment it contradicted his confidence. And somehow he started calling me unambitious. That word stayed with me, unambitious. I was managing his finances, coordinating his projects, and maintaining a household that allowed him to live without friction. But ambition, apparently, required visibility. And I had made myself invisible by keeping everything running. I noticed something else during this period. Daniel began narrating our life to other people differently. He talked about his sacrifices, his stress, his pressure. I was no longer part of the story unless I was being positioned as background support. Support is useful. Background is replaceable. I didn't confront him, not yet. I was still trying to understand the shape of the problem. I was still adjusting my expectations, convincing myself this was temporary, that success had simply changed the weather and we would recalibrate. What I didn't realize then was that the recalibration had already happened, just not in my favor. And by the time I understood that, Daniel had already decided I was standing in the way of something better. Through all of this, there was one person I believed was on my side. Rachel Morgan and I had been friends since high school. 20 years of shared history, breakups, babies, bad haircuts, late-night phone calls that ended with laughter instead of answers. She was the first person I called after Daniel announced the divorce. She listened. She reassured. She told me I deserved better. She came over with wine and sympathy and let me cry without interrupting. At least, that's what it looked like. What I didn't notice at first were the patterns, small things. Daniel mentioning plans I hadn't shared with him yet. Oliver repeating comments his father shouldn't have known I was considering. Casual remarks about neighborhoods I'd only discussed once, in confidence. Information doesn't teleport, it travels. Rachel always asked about Daniel first, how he was holding up, how the business was doing, whether he seemed stressed. I'd noticed it before, years earlier, but I'd dismissed it as curiosity. Loyalty makes excuses before it asks questions. Looking back, the signs were obvious. The way her face changed when Daniel entered a room. The way she laughed just a beat too long at his jokes. The way she framed his behavior generously, even when she was supposedly consoling me. Daniel had collected her admiration quietly, and when he needed it, he spent it. She became his relay, his reassurance, his early warning system. The realization didn't hurt the way betrayal usually does. It landed colder, cleaner, like closing a file after confirming what you already suspected. 20 years of friendship reduced to logistics and whispers. I didn't confront her. Confrontation would have warned Daniel. It would have closed the channel. I needed him comfortable. I needed him certain. I needed him believing that everyone saw me as defeated and alone. So I played my part. I told Rachel I was tired. I told her I couldn't fight anymore. I told her I just wanted things to be over. I let my voice crack in all the right places. Within hours, Daniel's posture would change. He'd relax. He'd push harder. He'd grow more careless. Rachel thought she was protecting him. In reality, she was documenting his arrogance. Some betrayals don't scream, they report. And every report made what was coming more inevitable. If the house had been the battlefield, Oliver was the line I refused to let anyone cross. Daniel never raised his voice to our son. He didn't need to. He used tone instead. Soft, reasonable, patient. The kind that sounds trustworthy even when it's carrying poison. He framed everything as concern. He told Oliver that I was making things difficult, that I was emotional, that I didn't understand how business worked. He said he just wanted peace. He said I was the one prolonging the pain. Slowly, my son began to pull away from me, not angrily, not dramatically. Just enough to notice, less eye contact, shorter answers, a hesitation before hugs that used to come naturally, confusion where certainty had lived. There were nights I questioned myself, not the plan, not the facts, myself. I would lie awake listening to the apartment settle, wondering if patience was strength or just another word for fear. Waiting looks dignified from the outside. Inside, it can feel like standing still while something precious drifts just out of reach. Watching Oliver pull away without correcting the narrative felt unnatural. Every instinct I had wanted to explain, to clarify, to defend myself. Silence doesn't come easily when love is involved. I told myself that timing mattered more than relief, that clarity delayed was better than confusion rushed. But patience has a price. It makes you quieter. It makes you lonelier. And it asks you to trust an outcome you can't yet prove. Watching that happen was worse than losing the house, worse than the money, worse than the humiliation. Because this wasn't about reputation. It was about trust. I wanted to explain everything, to sit Oliver down and expose every lie, every hidden detail, every manipulation. But explanations too early can sound like excuses. And children don't need to be recruited into adult wars. They need stability. So I stayed calm. I stayed present. I stayed consistent. When Oliver repeated things his father had said, I didn't contradict him. I didn't argue. I listened. I let the words settle. And I responded with something Daniel couldn't manufacture: time. Children notice patterns faster than adults give them credit for. They see disconnects. They feel tension between words and actions. They clock inconsistencies quietly and store them away. One evening, Oliver sat across from me in the small apartment I'd moved into after leaving the house. Second-hand table, unmatched chairs, boxes still stacked in corners. He looked older than his years. He said calmly, "Something doesn't make sense." I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't correct him. I let him finish. "I think Dad's pretending," he said. "I think he's not telling the truth about things." That was the moment I knew waiting had been the right choice. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I told him to keep watching, and I promised myself that whatever happened next, whatever it cost me, my son would never inherit confusion as his legacy. 3 years before Daniel asked for the divorce, I stayed up late reconciling accounts. Not because anything felt wrong yet, not because I was suspicious. It was simply part of the rhythm I'd lived inside for years. Quiet house, Oliver asleep, Daniel working late, laptop open, coffee gone cold. That night, I noticed a transfer I didn't recognize, then another, then a pattern. Money leaving familiar accounts and reappearing in places I'd never seen before. Accounts that weren't labeled, transfers that didn't match invoices, amounts that were just small enough to avoid attention, but frequent enough to matter. I didn't panic. Panic clouds math. I printed statements, cross-referenced dates, followed the trail the way I'd been trained to do years earlier, back when I worked for people who knew how to hide things, but not how to erase them. By 2 a.m, my stomach felt hollow. By 3, I understood. The house we lived in, the one people admired, the one Daniel bragged about, had 3 mortgages on it. Not 1, not 2, 3. The original loan. A second mortgage taken out quietly 4 years earlier. A third layered on top 2 years after that. Total owed more than the house was worth. We weren't homeowners. We were renters with paperwork. The business was worse. Lines of credit maxed out. Back taxes owed. Vendor balances quietly rolling forward. Equipment loans stacked like bricks in a wall that was already bowing. The company Daniel spoke about like a success story was surviving on borrowed time and borrowed money. Even the cars weren't ours, leased, balloon payments looming. Obligations disguised as perks. I sat alone in the kitchen, papers spread out like evidence at a crime scene, and did the math again, then again. Total liabilities exceeded assets by hundreds of thousands of dollars. We were upside down, deeply, and Daniel knew. There was one moment I don't talk about often, buried in the paperwork, between statements I'd already reviewed twice, was a line I almost skimmed past, a personal guarantee, signed quietly, dated years earlier, easy to miss if you're tired, easy to overlook if you're rushing toward conclusions. I remember staring at it longer than everything else. If I'd missed that line, the ending would have been different, cleaner for him, messier for me. That was the night I stopped trusting momentum, even my own. I rechecked every document after that, slowly, methodically, as if my future depended on margins, because it did. That realization landed with a strange calm. Fear had burned itself out and left clarity behind. This wasn't mismanagement, It was concealment. He wasn't building an empire. He was performing one. Over the following weeks, I dug deeper. Cryptocurrency losses he'd never mentioned. Gambling withdrawals disguised as business expenses. Rent payments on an apartment I'd never been inside, furnished for someone whose name I didn't know. Luxury purchases that never crossed our front door. The money hadn't disappeared. It had been spent on a life I wasn't part of. My first instinct was confrontation, to demand answers, to force honesty into the open. But I'd lived with Daniel long enough to know how that would end. Explanations, deflection, blame redirected until I questioned my own comprehension. And worse, if he knew I knew, he'd protect himself. So I did something else. I went quiet. That night, sitting alone with proof spread across the table, I stopped being confused, and I started being patient. Knowing changes the temperature of a room. Once I understood the truth, I couldn't unknow it. I ate dinner across from a man who was smiling through a lie, and I carried that knowledge alone. There is no shared language for that kind of awareness. I didn't sleep well for a long time, not from fear, but from containment. Every conversation required calibration. Every normal moment became performance. People think patience is passive. It isn't. It's active restraint, repeated daily with no audience and no reassurance that you're right. Once I understood the truth, everything slowed down. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I no longer needed answers. I already had them. What I needed now was insulation, protection, distance between Daniel's decisions and my future. I didn't confront him. I didn't hint. I didn't change my behavior enough for him to notice. I kept running the business exactly as I always had. Paid the bills he told me to pay, smoothed over the problems he didn't want to see, maintained the illusion he depended on. Silence became my camouflage. The first thing I protected was what had always been mine. Years earlier, when I left my law firm job to work for Daniel, I'd rolled my retirement account into an individual IRA. I never touched it, never borrowed against it, never blended it with marital funds. By the time I found the debt, it had grown into something solid, independent, legally clean. Then there was my grandmother. When she passed away, she left me an inheritance with very specific instructions. The money was for me alone, not for family expenses, not for emergencies, not for investments Daniel might someday need. I honored her precision. I kept it separate, untouched, quiet. Together, those accounts represented security Daniel didn't know existed. I worked with my uncle, a retired accountant who understood two things very well: documentation and discretion. We created an irrevocable trust for Oliver, not for me, not for Daniel, for our son's future, education, stability, a starting line no one could move. Once the trust was funded, the money was no longer accessible to either of us. Then I documented everything, every mortgage statement, every line of credit, every loan agreement Daniel had signed without reading. I printed copies, stored them with my sister, locked duplicates in a safe deposit box, backed everything up on an encrypted drive Daniel didn't know about. I wasn't hoarding evidence. I was preserving reality. And then I waited. Waiting is harder than confrontation. It requires restraint without validation. No one applauds patience. No one sees it happening. To the outside world, I looked oblivious, supportive, loyal. Daniel continued digging. He borrowed more, spent more, promised more. His confidence grew as his foundation weakened. He started talking openly about how much everything was worth, how well he'd done, how lucky he was. Men like Daniel mistake momentum for mastery. I smiled at dinners, attended events, listened without reacting, and every time he made a careless comment, every time he skipped over a detail, every time he dismissed a risk, I filed it away. People stop watching you when they think you've already lost. That was the gift. Because when Daniel finally decided to leave, when he demanded everything with absolute certainty, he walked directly into a trap that had been waiting patiently for 3 years. I didn't rush. I didn't interrupt. I let him believe he was winning. By the time lawyers became involved, Daniel had already decided how the story would end. He hired an expensive attorney, someone with a reputation, someone who spoke in measured tones and billed accordingly. Daniel liked that. It matched the version of himself he wanted reflected back to him. I hired mine quietly. Her name was Clara Vance, early 50s, sharp posture, sharper eyes, the kind of woman who didn't waste words or sympathy. She reviewed my situation with professional detachment and laid out what any reasonable person would expect. Half the house, half the business, shared responsibility for assets and debt. She waited for my reaction. I told her I didn't want to fight. The look she gave me was controlled but unmistakable. Disappointment mixed with concern. She thought I was exhausted, defeated. Another woman too worn down to advocate for herself. I let her think that. Driving to mediation, I had one quiet fear. Not that the plan would fail, but that I had waited too long. That timing, which had protected me for years, might finally betray me. I sat in the car with the engine off and reminded myself why I was here. Why speed had always favored him. Why patience had been my only advantage. I didn't rush in. I waited another minute. Then I went inside. At mediation, I became exactly who everyone expected me to be. There was a moment before mediation when I almost changed my mind. Not because I wanted more, but because I was tired of pretending I wanted less. Playing small requires discipline. It asks you to swallow pride without choking on it. I remember sitting in my car, hands on the steering wheel, thinking how easy it would be to demand half, how justified it would sound, how satisfying it would feel, and how much it would ruin everything. So I breathed. I straightened my posture, and I chose restraint again. Soft-spoken, apologetic, tired. I showed up with red eyes and careful phrasing. I thanked people for their time. I said I didn't want to make things harder than they already were. I acknowledged how important the business was to Daniel, how much the house meant to him. I asked for very little, a modest cash settlement, my personal belongings, shared custody of Oliver. That was it. The mediator looked uncomfortable. Clara stayed silent, watching me closely. Daniel agreed immediately. He didn't even negotiate. His relief was visible. The tension he'd been carrying evaporated as soon as he realized I wasn't going to challenge him. He leaned back in his chair, smiled like a man who'd just avoided a costly inconvenience. Outside the room, he told anyone who would listen that I'd given up, that I hadn't even tried, that he'd offered something fair and I'd taken it gratefully. His mother bragged openly. Friends nodded knowingly. Even Rachel echoed the narrative, delivering updates with thinly veiled pity. Everyone thought they were watching a woman collapse. What they were actually watching was camouflage. Because when you ask for nothing, people stop guarding everything. Daniel stopped being careful. He stopped filtering his behavior. He stopped listening to advice. His arrogance expanded into the space where caution should have lived. And Clara, finally understanding, smiled to herself and said nothing. The smaller I played, the larger his mistake became. The trap wasn't dramatic. There were no secret clauses written in invisible ink. No loopholes, no tricks, just structure, the kind most people ignore because it looks boring and sounds tedious. Assets come with liabilities. Daniel never learned that distinction because things had always worked out for him before. When money got tight, he borrowed. When pressure built, he deferred. When someone warned him, he tuned them out. Momentum had always carried him forward, and he mistook that for proof of competence. The settlement agreement reflected exactly what he wanted. Every asset transferred fully into his name, the house, the business, the vehicles, every account tied to them. Attached to that agreement was an addendum, a detailed liability disclosure statement. Every mortgage, every loan, every line of credit, every lease obligation associated with the assets he was so eager to claim. Nothing hidden, nothing exaggerated. Numbers pulled directly from statements he'd signed himself. His attorney recommended an independent financial audit before finalizing anything, strongly recommended it, put it in writing, explained that verification was protection. Daniel refused. He said he built the business. He said he knew what it was worth. He said he wasn't paying someone to tell him what he already understood. He wanted this done quickly. He wanted to move on. He wanted to start his new life without delays. His attorney had him sign a waiver acknowledging that advice had been given and declined. Daniel signed without reading it. That moment mattered more than anything else, because by signing that waiver, Daniel didn't just accept the assets, he accepted responsibility for understanding them. He confirmed that he was informed, advised, and choosing certainty over caution. I didn't need to push. I didn't need to explain. All I had to do was let his confidence carry him forward. Legal documents don't punish emotion. They reward clarity. And Daniel had provided exactly that. The courtroom was quiet in the way only official spaces are. Polished wood, muted colors. The low murmur of paperwork being shuffled into order. Nothing about the room suggested disaster. Daniel arrived early. He wore his best suit, the charcoal one I'd helped him choose years earlier because it photographed well and hid stress in the shoulders. A new watch caught the light when he shook his lawyer's hand. He looked rested, confident, like a man about to walk away with everything he believed he deserved. His girlfriend waited in the hallway, not allowed inside, but close enough to feel included. His mother sat in the gallery, posture straight, already rehearsing her victory lunch plans. I arrived a few minutes later, simple dress, no jewelry, hair pulled back. I looked exactly how people expected me to look. Tired, finished, someone who had come to accept her losses. The judge reviewed the file, confirmed that an agreement had been reached, asked both attorneys to summarize. Daniel's lawyer spoke first, calm, professional, clear. His client would assume full ownership of the marital assets, the residence, the business, the vehicles. In exchange, I would receive a modest cash settlement and shared custody of our son. My attorney stood next, confirmed the same. Then the judge looked at me. She asked if I understood what I was agreeing to, if I was aware that I was relinquishing claims to substantial property. If anyone had pressured me into this decision, I answered softly, clearly, voluntarily. I said I wanted Daniel to have everything he asked for. The judge studied me for a long moment. The pause stretched. I could feel her weighing intervention against autonomy. But I was represented. I was composed. I was consenting. She nodded. Proceed. The documents were distributed. Daniel signed quickly, confident strokes, barely glanced at the pages. This was a formality to him, not a process, something to get through so the real celebration could begin. I signed slowly, not for effect, for awareness. Across the table, Daniel smiled at his mother. She returned it. A quiet exchange of certainty. Then his attorney reached the addendum. I watched his face change. First confusion, then concentration. He flipped a page back, then forward. His posture stiffened, his mouth tightened. He leaned toward Daniel and whispered 5 words. Just 5. Daniel waved him off at first, still smiling, still certain. Then his attorney tried again, more urgently. Daniel finally looked down. I watched the color leave his face as his eyes moved across the numbers. Watched his confidence drain as comprehension replaced assumption. Mortgages exceeding value, business debt stacked high, lease obligations, personal guarantees, net worth negative. This wasn't a victory, it was a transfer of weight. Daniel stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. His voice rose. He accused, claimed deception, claimed fraud. The judge shut it down immediately. The documents were reviewed, the waiver produced, the advisory refusal confirmed. Daniel had been warned. He had declined review. He had signed willingly. These were his debts, his obligations, his assets. The agreement stood. The gavel came down. Final. I gathered my things, smoothed my dress, looked at Daniel one last time. You wanted everything, I said quietly. I made sure you got it. And I walked out without waiting for a response. Some people will understand exactly what that moment felt like. They won't need it explained. The collapse didn't arrive all at once. It never does. At first, there were explanations, delays, blame placed carefully on timing, on markets, on misunderstandings that would surely resolve themselves. Daniel told people the hearing had been complicated. He said lawyers had overreacted. He said everything was under control, but debt doesn't respond to confidence. Within weeks, Lena disappeared, moved out quietly, taking her things in the middle of the day while Daniel was at work. She left a note that said this wasn't what she signed up for. No forwarding address, no goodbye. The house went on the market next, not because Daniel wanted to sell, but because the payments were coming due faster than excuses could cover them. Buyers hesitated. Banks didn't. When something is worth less than what's owed, optimism becomes irrelevant. Then the business began to crack. Vendors demanded payment. Lines of credit froze. Contractors stopped answering calls. The momentum Daniel had relied on for years vanished overnight, replaced by phone calls he stopped returning. Within 2 months, he was meeting with bankruptcy attorneys. The man who once spoke in projections was now asking what could be protected. The answer, as it turned out, was very little. Evelyn's confidence evaporated next. She started calling relatives, friends, anyone who might listen. She explained, she reframed. She suggested Daniel had been misled, that someone else must have hidden the truth. The documents disagreed. Every loan carried his signature. Every obligation traced back to his decisions. The story he told himself for years finally ran out of space. I heard all of this secondhand. I didn't comment, I didn't celebrate, I didn't correct anyone. Collapse doesn't need an audience, it just needs time. And Daniel had already spent all of his. The loudest part of all of this was never Daniel's collapse. It was what happened after. Oliver didn't need an explanation. He didn't need a speech or a reveal or a breakdown of numbers. He watched, He noticed he connected the pieces on his own, the way children do when they're finally given space to observe instead of being persuaded. He saw Lena leave. He heard the excuses change. He noticed how his father spoke less and worried more. One evening, he sat across from me at our small kitchen table. The apartment still smelled faintly of fresh paint. Sage green. The same color I'd once chosen trying to make someone else's life feel calmer. This time, it wasn't aspirational. It was accurate. "You waited," he said. Not accusing, just stating a fact. I nodded. "You knew," he said. I nodded again. There was a long pause. Then he reached across the table and hugged me. Not the quick, awkward kind teenagers tolerate out of obligation. The kind that settles. The kind that lingers. That mattered more than anything else that had happened. The trust fund stayed untouched, his future secured quietly, without drama or announcements. College, stability, options, a safety net no one could negotiate away. As for the others, Rachel called once. Her voice sounded unsteady, apologetic. She said she hadn't known things were that bad. She said she never meant for anyone to get hurt. I didn't return the call. Some bridges collapse because they were never built on honesty to begin with. Evelyn tried reaching out through Oliver, asked for forgiveness, asked for understanding, asked for access. Oliver declined on my behalf. "Mom's busy," he said. "She's building her life." He wasn't wrong. Peace arrived quietly. No announcement, no applause. Just the absence of chaos where it used to live. That was the win. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, furniture that didn't match yet. Boxes unpacked slowly, 1 weekend at a time. Nothing about it looked impressive, and that was exactly why it felt right. Every decision inside those walls belonged to me. I enrolled in interior design courses at the community college a month after the divorce finalized. The program I'd once talked myself out of when I was 23, because Daniel needed help, because the business needed me, because there was always something more urgent than my own plans. This time, I didn't postpone it. My first client was a woman named Sandra, early 50s, ending a long marriage, standing in an empty apartment with keys in her hand and no idea where to start. She asked me how people rebuild after everything collapses. I told her the truth, 1 room at a time, 1 decision at a time, 1 color that reminds you you're allowed to choose again. We painted her kitchen sage green. She cried when she saw it. Daniel came by once, months later. He looked smaller, not physically, though that too, but in the way men do when certainty leaves them. His suit was wrinkled. The watch was gone. He spoke carefully, like someone testing ground he no longer trusted. He said he didn't know it was that bad. He said he'd made mistakes. He said maybe we could talk. Maybe we could figure something out. I leaned against the doorframe and listened. Then I reminded him that he'd asked for everything, and I closed the door. That night, after Oliver went to bed, I sat alone in the living room and looked at my grandmother's photograph on the shelf. Her recipe box sat beside it, the one thing I'd protected without hesitation. "You were right," I said quietly. "Keep your own money, know your worth, and never confuse silence for weakness." The life I lived now was smaller than the one I'd left behind. Fewer rooms, fewer appearances, less noise, but it was honest, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, nothing in my life belonged to someone else more than it belonged to me. People think justice is loud. They expect explosions, confessions, public apologies. But real consequences usually arrive quietly. They show up as paperwork, as signatures, as moments when someone realizes too late that confidence isn't the same as control. And that was enough.